Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to farmer Jesse Frost about regenerative agriculture and his new book, The Living Soil Handbook. Regenerative ag is a farming practice focused on restoring soil and environmental health through the three main tenets of disturbing the soil as little as possible, keeping soil covered as much as possible, and keeping it planted as much as possible. In this episode, Jesse will walk us through these tenets and how they can help farmers succeed. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsors, starting with Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Our second sponsor is GasMet Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers. Visit www.gasmet.com, that's Gasmet spelled GASMET, or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Jesse Frost with us. Jesse is a farmer and podcaster from Central Kentucky whose work centers around no-till practices for intensive vegetable production. Jesse hosts the No-Till Market Garden podcast and is the author of The Living Soil Handbook, the No-Till Grower's Guide to Ecological Market Gardening. Hi, Jesse. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm so excited to be here, Abby. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we are so excited to have you on. So, today we are going to be talking about your new book. Congratulations. I know that's a huge deal. And also regenerative agriculture at large. So, before we launch in here, can you tell us more about your podcast, specifically your audience and goals, so people know kind of the framework of which you are normally communicating?
Sure. So the No-Till Market Garden podcast is a sort of interview style, much like this podcast, where I'm calling primarily growers, ecologically driven growers who focus on soil health, and primarily vegetable production. I haven't done a lot in animal production. I've kind of, any sort of protein production. I've definitely focused in on vegetables. And we also had an offshoot that focused specifically on flower production. That was No Till Flowers podcast. We've done a lot of offshoots, but my podcast in particular, the No Till Market Garden podcast, is focused on kind of bringing out into the open practices that do minimize tillage and focus heavily on soil health and biodiversity, and various climates and contexts. So, our audience is primarily farmers, but with some, I also venture out and bring in agronomists, and I've even interviewed somebody who, concentrated on. Their work was all with earthworms and various elements of that all are relative to no-till market gardening. But primarily the audience is farmers.
Nice. Yeah, I, as everyone who's ever listened to the show knows, I am not a farmer, but have mad respect for them. But I listened to a few episodes in preparation, and I loved it. I listened to, I think was it Justin Gay from Xanadu Seeds? Great episode. I recommend that one specifically. Just like super interesting, and just listening to the amount of work that farmers put in to even just show up at a farmer's market is just astonishing. And it just makes me really happy to be like, wow, like these people are so cool. So I enjoyed that very much. Very informative. Even if you're not a farmer, you should check it out. It's good stuff. Yeah, so I think that sets the stage nicely for where you're coming from for this conversation. And as I mentioned, we are talking about regenerative ag today. So to get us started on the bulk of our conversation, can you define what does regenerative agriculture mean to you? What is your definition?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to ask that question too, right? My definition, because it does seem that there's a lot of different definitions out there. And I think, I've been in this space, one voice in this very, very broad and diverse space for several years now. And it wasn't really until this past year that I started giving much thought to what my definition is. And I kind of started really evaluating this idea of regeneration, and because it started to pop up in a lot of different fields. I mean, obviously, regenerative medicine has been around for a long time, but you also see, regenerative braking systems and regenerative finance and all sorts of other areas where the idea of regeneration has been attached. And of course, listeners will know, or at least basically understand, regeneration is when something is damaged or lost, it is the organism rebuilds it itself. So many examples abound of that idea of like axolotl salamanders being able to regenerate large portions of their body and that are actually fully regenerated in some cases. Then there's, lizards that can regenerate their tail, even though it isn't exactly an exact replica, but it does, provide the form, the balance that they need. And starfish there's certain starfish that can regenerate like almost their entire bodies from a single limb, which is incredible. And then the human can regenerate parts of our liver and parts of our skin. So there's this idea of like having an injury, or some sort of damage, and then being able to recreate what was damaged. And how that, for me, when I think about that with soil and I think about that with agriculture, I think that, it's kind of a perfect analogy. All terms are imperfect just inherently, but, it is kind of a great analogy for the soil because the soil is capable of regenerating itself. Now, where the agriculture comes in is more about assisting in that process. For me, it has always been about, you have this battery, the soil, that is collecting solar energy through its solar panels, plants, and putting those into the soil and through photosynthesis, and that collecting that energy and turning it into various things, microbes, roots, fungi, etc. And so it's not the job of the farmer to do that. The plants are doing that. The job of the farmer and the job of the regenerative farmer is to facilitate that. And I think that's, where those sort of ideas that maybe we'll talk about here shortly that I sort of centered the book around the main principles of conservation agriculture, of keeping the soil planted, keeping it covered, and keeping it, undisturbed as much as possible. And I think that's where those come in, because that's more the role of the farmer. And that's what I think of when I think of regenerative farming is, facilitating photosynthesis.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And as I was reading kind of that introductory section of your book, I really like that you phrase it as this kind of choose your own adventure, partly because choose your own adventure books are really fun, but also just your book seems very focused on finding what is reasonable to do and makes sense, rather than just kind of this you have to do X, Y, and Z to be successful, which is something I think comes up on our show a lot is, you have to pay attention to, what kind of soil do you have in your area? What kind of precipitation do you get? Heat is obviously a huge factor and length of growing season, any of those things. So I really liked that approach in your book of just being very, obviously, at some point, you will probably disturb the soil at some point. Don't panic. It's okay. It's a very gracious approach, and I like that a lot. But I think it would be helpful. You just mentioned those three larger tenets of regenerative or conservational agriculture. So I was hoping we could dive into those three guidelines, I guess, and tell me more about what they are and why they're so important to regenerative agriculture.
Yeah. So like I talked about with, defining regenerative agriculture, you have to have a framework for how to actually accomplish that. Like, what is the role of the farmer being the steward? What does that look like? And for a little background, many years ago, I've really been interested in no-till agriculture for a long time. But and I learned to farm on a tillage sort of row crop, but very soil health conscious farm for 2 years. I interned there. And that's kind of what my background was. But I was really interested in this idea of reducing tillage for all the reasons that we've always known, reduction in, weed pressure, increase in crop productivity and soil health and all of those things, and just maybe saving yourself some time and not having to cultivate all the time. So I was really interested in the idea of no tillage and reducing tillage. And, I came across like a couple pamphlets, I guess it was probably 10 or 12 years ago, and they were about conservation agriculture, talking about those three main principles of keep the soil covered as much as possible, keep it planted as much as possible, and disturb it as little as possible, with the fourth one kind of being like with as much plant diversity as possible. And I would come across those and I would find very little that, I would be like, great, I'm on board. Cool. Now flip to the section where it tells you how to do that. And it would basically just say something like use cover crops, but it really wouldn't give you enough information about what that looked like. So, it felt to me as if, especially on our scale, the technical details were missing. I mean, we've had people like Jeff Moyer at the Notill Institute developing kind of larger scale no-till techniques with cover crops. But what about somebody that's on 3/4 of an acre or an acre, rolling and crimping cover crops over, leaving your crops your beds out of production for 6 months when you're on a really small acreage is a lot of money. So like what alternatives are there? And so each of those, I kind of built the book around those three principles, trying to offer the technical details. Some of them. I mean, there's so many ways to do it. And like you said, it's a choose your own adventure. So it gives you a lot of different ideas and options for things that people have used successfully, for many things that I've used successfully on my farm. But we can kind of go through each just briefly and talk about what those look like on a technical level. So when we're talking about keeping the soil covered as much as possible, we're generally talking about mulch. And for me, for a long time, I thought of mulch as two different things. It would either be cover crops or it would be straw/hay. And what I hadn't known was really a possibility was the idea of mulching with things like compost. That's one that kind of has really picked up steam over the last few years. In Europe, they call it the no-dig system, really pioneered really pioneered by people like Charles Dowding and Richard Perkins. And then here in the United States, we call it the deep compost mulch system. Some of the people that I first learned about that was like Singing Frogs Farm. My buddy Josh Satin uses that a lot too, and we use it on our farm to some extent. And that's the idea here, is that you're layering kind of a deep layer of compost over top of a bed, and then you're using that both as a growing medium and as a mulch. And I'm sure that the agronomists in the audience have question marks popping up because the nutrient applications are very heavy, and the various issues that can come with compost and what is compost, and all of these different questions. But these various methods have allowed people on a smaller acreage to utilize that idea of keeping the soil covered without necessarily always using cover crops for that job. However, I will say that there are people that have also developed techniques for cover cropping that don't involve a big roller crimper, such as Daniel Mays at Frith Farm has done a really great job of developing a system on 3 acres of using cover crops that he terminates with a silage tarp, black silage tarp, crimps it down, puts the silage tarp over for several weeks. That occultation, that cutting off from the sunlight, but also heating, helps to terminate that rye cover crop generally. And that will allow for him to pull that back and plant his fall brassicas, for instance, or using winter-killed cover crops like peas and oats and those sorts of things in the late summer, letting those get really tall. They die over the winter. They keep the soil mulched and armored over the winter. They can be raked off in the spring, and then things like can be direct seeded like carrots and those sorts of things. So there's that's where the technical details have started to fill out a little bit, where we're looking at these practices and trying to figure out how to utilize them on a small scale. So that's kind of keeping the soil covered as much as possible. Now, keeping it planted as much as possible has, really developed, it kind of becomes a lot, like we've picked up a lot of tips out of the horticultural world, which is, important to look to the people who do this stuff professionally in really intensive environments. A lot of the growers that I'm talking to and talking about are, very intensive growers. We're getting multiple crops out of a bed in a single year. Oftentimes we're intercropping. We're planting more than one species in the same bed at the same time. And we're doing successions. We're doing relay crops. And there's very little time where the bed is not photosynthesizing. And it's not very little time where the bed is not completely full of living plants. And the idea there is not just to maximize the photosynthetic process there to get it on as much of the bed covered in plants as possible, while still allowing for the space that the plants need to produce. But it's also a financial element too. I mean, it's more profitable if we're getting more crops out of the same space. So, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's a lot of different techniques that have been developed. And there's a lot of stuff we're still working on and coming across. And there's certain crops that don't work well together. There's certain crops that can't work in certain densities. A lot of agronomists that are listening may be familiar with the critical period of weed control or the critical period of competition. I talk a little bit about that in the book. This idea that, if you plant crops too close together, they do have a tendency to affect one another's growth. And carrots are a prime example of that. I thought for a really long time that carrots were a good interplant, but I found that when interplanted too closely and the timing is off, that the plant didn't have time to establish itself for about 8 weeks. That's not true. About 6 weeks. If the carrots aren't in the ground for about that amount of time before something else is competing with them, they tend to grow really tall greens and really small tubers, really small roots rather. And that has an effect on your yield. So that's a example of a poor interplant. But a good interplant would be something like tomatoes down the middle of a bed. We keep all of our beds permanent. That's another kind of element of all this, and we'll talk about that and when I talk about disturbing the soil as little as possible. But in a situation like tomatoes, you have a row down the middle of a bed, and then on the sides of the bed, you're planting lettuce or beets or radishes or escarole or whatever makes sense for your context. And you're getting a second crop while that tomato plant is maturing, and then you're pulling that crop out. The tomato the tomato plant maybe takes over the bed, depending on the size of the bed. But you're getting multiple crops, so there's a profitability element there. There's also a diversity in the exudates and et cetera that you're pumping into the soil, and all the different microbes that are gathering around those exudates. So you're just adding diversity, as much biodiversity as you can, while also keeping it reasonable for a market garden scale. And then we can kind of move to keeping the soil disturbed as little as possible. This is the one that really takes some, a little bit more defining of what tillage is to really appreciate it. So if I'm allowed a quick digression here, Abby, we talk about tillage, and I think that it's not very well defined right now. Because when you talk about tillage, oftentimes people conflate it with disturbance. And those two things are not necessarily the same. Disturbance is an essential part of soil. Soil is in a constant state of disturbance. The difference is, from earthworms, from roots moving around, from microbes. I mean, if you took a cross-section of the soil over the course of 20 years, it would look like it's churning, not just kind of sitting there. Soil aggregates are kind of moving around at all times. And so that, and it's a slow process and it's a gentle process. And that's kind of one thing that I think about, is that people often assume that humans can't have that same effect. Like, we can't have the same biological beneficial disturbance as an earthworm, but I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that that's actually our role, is to have some amount of small biological or small, disturbances that promote biology, because that's going to be the most beneficial thing for the soil. And when it comes to tillage is not about whether or not you're disturbing the soil. The tillage is more about whether or not you're causing long-term damage to the soil. And we think of tillage as Traditionally, or if you look at the dictionary, tillage is often defined as preparing the soil for growing crops, which makes sense because for thousands of years, that's all we really could do. And all indigenous cultures could do is prepare small plots of ground, with bones and various tools to open it up and plant. And then often those were fallowed. And then maybe a few years later, they were replanted. But then machinery entered the picture, and large scale, tillage became turning ground over on a larger scale became much easier. And so what effectively happens is that you have different effects from tillage. And the word tillage, like many words in the dictionary, has started to change meaning because it's taking on those new effects of what tillage is now versus what tillage used to be. And tillage used to be something very small, and now it can be very wide. And we saw in the 1930s the Dust Bowl, and that was a cause of large-scale tillage, large-scale turning over of crops, of soil in a dry area. And then NASA has even said that this is one of the worst drought. I think it was 1934 was one of the worst droughts in 1,000 years, and it caused massive erosion, wind erosion, and that's where we got the Dust Bowl. And that's where what tillage has started to develop to, turn into is this idea of what larger scale, what damaging mechanical tillage can do to soil. And so when we're talking about no-till, we're talking about things that avoid erosion, that, that think about droughts and that are prepared for droughts and that are more, soil forward, that are thinking about that soil battery and maximizing that at all times. And when you do that, you don't run into that risk of having soil erosion. And maybe on occasion, it does require some either initial or partially sustained disturbance of some sort. So in an example of like a small amount of disturbance that is beneficial would be like the broad fork. This is a tool that is essentially a large fork that growers will put into their permanent beds, slightly lift the soil up, kind of just pop in a little bit of air for gas exchange and to allow roots to get a little bit further into the compaction, and use that over the course of several years. You just do it once a season or maybe once every crop if you're in really heavy clay or something like that, especially in the first few years. And over time, you don't need it. It slowly breaks up the soil, breaks up the compaction, and the plants are better able to reach deeper into the soil. And so when we do that, we're trying to allow for better root penetration, better gas exchange, all of those things. But it's not necessarily the same thing as tillage, because what we're doing is soil forward. We're trying to promote that soil battery. We're trying to, regenerate that soil. And often one of the things that happens when people want to think about or switch to no-till is they assume that any sort of disturbance is negative disturbance. And not to repeat myself there, but something like the broad fork actually enables the soil to better perform what it's set to do, what it's meant to do. And that's been proven on many farms. And the idea there is just we have to address things like compaction, or we're not effectively catering to the soil battery and to the plants, and to our own, income and to our own crops, because growing in compacted soil that doesn't drain or is too dry is extremely hard to do. And, there's a point at which it won't, you can take a lot of hits for many years. I mean, it's been shown that compaction, just using basic methods, can take a decade to eliminate, even 8 or 10 inches down. So that's something that I think about a lot, is just how can we think about compaction and tillage, addressing compaction without conflating it with tillage. And sometimes it means opening up the soil to begin with and then getting it covered with a mulch or getting it covered with a cover crop, and just getting the soil broken up and so that it's pliable, and then allowing for those roots to get as deep as possible to kind of start building that soil organic matter 10, 12, or 18 inches under, below the soil, below the surface. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. Is there anything in there, Abby, that I should keep going on?
Oh man, I mean, given a blank check, like I would just let you go forever. That is just like everything in there is really interesting. And I'm so glad you brought up the kind of redefining tillage, because as I was reading, I was like, oh, like that's really interesting. And I've never heard anything like that before. So that was actually something I was going to maybe bring up myself. So thank you for doing that for me. Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Jesse's book is now for sale with Chelsea Green Publishing at chelseagreen.com. Use discount code POD35 for 35% off. You can also check out our Twitter at FieldLabEarth for the chance to win a free copy. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gasmet Technologies and Meter Group. For Gasmet Technologies, conduct greenhouse gas flux measurements in the field using the GT5000 Terra. Weighing 20.7 pounds, splash-proof IP54 rated, internal pump and battery, and vibration resistant, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork. Visit www.gasmet.com or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. I think that covers it really well. There was kind of another thing that we were hoping to talk about today, so I'm gonna transfer us over to that, which is something I really appreciated about your book. Was it's well, for one thing, it's very well written in general, but also it's written in a way that is very accessible for someone like me, or I imagine a layperson who's just looking to get started. In that it's very accessible to read. So that was something you kind of wanted to talk about as far as science communication and how researchers can maybe better communicate their research to the people who are, doing the boots on the ground work. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something I've been, when I was researching the book, and this is maybe something that's kind of always been in my head, but it definitely, when I started researching the book, I started to see all of this really exceptional growing information that was sort of buried in the scientific jargon, in the scientific literature, various articles and publications that I found that were really brilliant, really interesting, had a lot of great insight, great information on small scale plant production that I had never heard about. I was blown away with the number of studies on foliar sprays, the number of studies on vermicast, the number of studies on phenol production, and the list goes on. And I was just thinking that some of it felt very inaccessible to me. I mean, I've read a lot of scientific papers. I enjoy reading them. I've gotten used to it. It's not anything I was trained in. I didn't go to school for something like that. And it started to occur to me that there's just all this information that's kind of buried that is not as accessible to the average person who it could benefit. And I'm really specifically talking about farmers. Not that farmers aren't smart enough to read a scientific paper, but a lot of that language is difficult. It's dense. I mean, a lot of people avoid or not, a lot of people are not going to get into people like Thomas Pynchon because they don't have time to read really dense literature. And the same thing goes for scientific literature, where it's so dense, it feels a little bit out of reach. And it's also, some of it is, there's paywalls, and there's just simply tracking it down and reading through introductions of various papers to find various other papers that could be of interest. So it's a lot of work. And it started to occur to me, and this is just kind of the nature of it. And I understand the reasons why there are, paywalls, and why some of the scientific jargon is there, because it's more exact, it's more precise, and I appreciate that. But it started to occur to me that a lot of, when you think about medical papers, for instance, they're typically written by researchers and doctors and physicians for other researchers and doctors and physicians. And that makes sense. So the paper is kind of written for the people who it will most benefit, the people who are going to need it the most. And the same thing goes for papers on physics and the papers on chemistry. But those papers for agronomy and horticulture are often written for other people in the field of agronomy and horticulture and not for the farmers. Like, it's one of the few areas of, research that the papers are written more for the other researchers and not for the intended audience. And I think there's a huge value in researchers being able to communicate their ideas back and forth, but I think that there needs to be some amount of focus on making sure that farmers are getting that information. And that's one thing that just while we're on the subject to compliment you on, Abby, is this podcast has been great for me to learn about various things that I may not be aware that they're out there, various researchers and people in the field that whose work could really benefit what I'm doing. You and John Kempf and the Regenerative Agriculture podcast and Graham Sate and nutrition farming, those are very valuable assets to me. But I think we need more because, not everybody listens to podcasts. Not everybody reads books. Not everybody reads articles. Not everybody watches YouTube. There has to be a diversity of options for people. And the more people who are good at the SciComm element of all this, I'd like to see them going out and doing more TikTok videos or doing more YouTube or just doing more, being on more podcasts and trying to get their information out there to the people that it could most help. And I think that that's a really, seeing how much brilliant, amazing information and research is out there and knowing that it's often just getting passed back and forth between researchers was kind of both, exciting for me to know that existed, but also kind of it fueled me to want to speak up about it and just make sure that people were aware that was something that could, like, there are a lot of farmers, really savvy farmers, that would love that information. And the more we can figure out ways to conjugate that information in a way that people, or just synthesize it in a way that that the average person can pick up on it and find it and read it and understand what its implications could be, even if it's not exact, right? We're never going to get to the bottom of really anything in science, but if we can get some good indications of things that work and things that maybe don't work, especially when it comes to, biological applications or, different tillage techniques or any of those things that people are working on, disseminate that out to the audiences that could most benefit from it. I think that would be great. And like I said, I think podcasts like yours are doing a great job of that.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. That's our goal, is to get the work out there. I'm happy to be kind of the non-researcher mouthpiece that people have to funnel through to get the knowledge across. So happy to serve in that role, and very blessed and lucky to be able to do so. Because, the research that's out there is just phenomenal and super cool. So very happy to be involved. And I think that's something that's come up on our show a lot. And I think there is kind of that really important intermediary step. And I was just thinking about this the other day. There's a blog called The Scholarly Kitchen, which deals a lot with the state of scholarly publications. And on Fridays in the summer, they post just fun videos. And they did one on jargon. And I believe it was Dave Crotty was the person who posted that time. And he said, there's a reason that there's jargon in research papers. And it's because, other researchers, like, you can't spend all of your research paper explaining what DNA is for a genetics paper. Like, you have to, for a research paper, you kind of have to come to it with some pre-knowledge, and they have to be written that way for a variety of reasons. Efficiency of communication being perhaps foremost among them for the jargon reasons. But I think you're right that there is this really nice niche of, extension programs do a lot of that work of kind of translating the research into something that is more easily digestible for the people who are then actually going to be using it. So, I really like that idea. I think it's definitely something that we're always looking into as a society, and we've talked about, how can we add those pieces, whether it's adding a podcast or a video summary or a graphical abstract. Those are all things we've looked at here to make that a little bit easier. So I like that a lot. And thank you for the work that you're doing in, not only in your book, really translating a lot of those, but also in your podcast of, taking these things, whether it's taking something at a larger scale and making it work at a smaller scale, or just in general translating that is really good work. So thanks for that. Really appreciate it. Yeah. So I think, speaking of, things we can do moving forward, what are some big areas for future research that you see for regenerative agriculture and the other areas that you're working in?
Yeah, so some of the things, it has to be area specific. And I would like to see, one thing that I would like to see, and maybe this kind of goes along, it's kind of combines the last question with this one, is more options for farmers to work alongside agronomists and alongside scientists and engineers. And, an example of that is I recently had a friend come over who's an engineer, and he kind of redesigned a piece of my wash pack station where we wash our root vegetables, and it really increased the efficiency. And I just thought, this is like a practical way that some of that information could be utilized. That there would be, maybe more teams of people in specific areas who are really familiar with the climate and the production in those areas, going to farms that are like ours, that are high profit, but, not large acreage, and helping them to develop their systems a little bit more, just being like, what your issue is here. I'm running some SAP analyses here, and I'm seeing that your issue is X nutrient. Going out there and having more consultation, on-farm consultation, and having people who are in those fields come out and spend more time in the fields with the growers would be hugely beneficial for everybody. I think that people on the research side would probably enjoy that too, being out in those fields a little bit more and spending a little time working and being like, oh, okay, so I'm seeing some of the issues that I've seen in the textbooks or I've seen in other papers. Here's what I think is going on here. Even if it's small things, even if it's I think your tomato production is good, but I could see a 20% increase if you change this one thing, based on this research that I've come across. And I think there are people that could probably do that. They drive around and they look at gardens and they think, oh, they should be doing it this way because they've been studying that for a long time. So maybe there's more collaboration potential down the line. I think there was even a paper, and I have no idea where it was, who wrote it. I think it was out of Denmark or something, where they had scientists actually work on farms and saw a 20% increase in the farmer's production, or something. I'm completely, those numbers are wrong, but it was something, but there's this idea of if you had people who do that research spending more times on the farm, that could be massively helpful. And then it could also be, I think a lot of people that sign up for ecology degrees and, degrees in science and agronomy want to spend more time in the field. I don't think that they necessarily want to spend all their time in a lab or all their time behind a desk. So I think there could be a lot of potential there, and maybe that's one way of disseminating that information. So lots of potential for future research there. And then also just developing these techniques, developing on the grower side, developing techniques for, growing without tillage, various ways of planting and turning beds over from one crop to another, various interplanting techniques. I also think there needs to be, I'm jumping around a little bit here because this kind of goes back to what I was just saying a minute ago, but more of an option for growers to take some of the control into their own hands. I think something like a SAP analyses, we need more tools that are affordable, that are we can take a leaf SAP analysis in the field and get an almost instant reading. We need that tool. And I don't know if it exists, but I kind of think if it does, it's expensive. And we need something that, we need a little bit more control and a little bit of opportunity to be able to do those things in situ while we're out in the field, while we're working on what we're doing, and maybe and then maybe coupled with the consultation thing. I think that's a huge area of potential there, that we could foresee lots of, great collaborations and really high productivity and high soil health, like just, good carbon sequestration, good ecological habitats that are, maybe set up with the help of an ecologist. And those sorts of things. And maybe that's a better version of extension, because you'd mentioned extension earlier. Almost nobody in my world bothers with extension. Not that they don't have a lot of great people working for extension, but those extension tends to be focused on corn and soybeans, livestock, that sort of stuff. And that's fine. I mean, there's a place for that. But when we go in talking about vegetable production, there's often very few people in there that have any experience with it. And maybe the future of extension, or the evolution of extension, could be to having more people who are focused on soil health, and therefore doesn't necessarily matter as much what the crop is. It matters what their experience with managing soil health is, because it doesn't always matter what the crop is. It matters how the soil is treated, and the microbiology in the soil, and the the nutrients, and etc. So in the pliability, is the compaction addressed? Is there sufficient water? Where's the water coming from? All those elements are of grave importance, and somebody who mainly studies corn can still go into a vegetable farm with those sort of ideas and be like, well, this is where I maybe see some issues. So yeah, I mean, I think those are some ideas that kind of come to mind.
Gosh, that's amazing. And yeah, extension people, there's a tip for an open niche that needs to be filled. If you're looking for a new area. I've got 3 questions left for you. So the first is, if people want to learn more about any of these topics, where can they go? I will say, I mentioned this in the mid-roll, but in case you skipped the mid-roll, which is fine, we will have a discount code for your book and opportunities for a giveaway. So there will be more information in the show notes, specifically on our website. If you're in iTunes, you might get like a little truncated version. But yeah, so there you can check that out for sure. But where else besides your wonderful book can they go?
Yeah, so we do, the no-till, so notillgrowers.com is our main hub. You can go there and you can find the various podcasts that we put together. We do No-Till Flowers. We do the Winter Growers podcast. We just launched, and this is appropriate, Abby, as the Collaborative Farming podcast. And that's a podcast that just talks to various farms and farm entities, agricultural entities that are working together and in various forms, from cooperatives to, we just talked to the Culinary Breeding Network about some of the ways that they're working with connecting breeders with chefs and customers to develop different crops, and instead of just the breeders develop something and then they give it to the farmers and the farmers grow it, they're talking to like all parts of the system. Like, what do chefs want out of a crop? What do consumers want out of a crop? So various collaborations. So that's one that just launched. The host is Jackson Roulette, and he's also my partner at notillgrowers.com. He helped me co-found that. The book is an option. We also do YouTube. We do videos. We have a live show every other week with a different grower that's hosted by Josh Satin, and that's just you can get on and you can talk to a grower, a successful grower, and ask them all sorts of questions. And that is every other Tuesday on the No Till Growers YouTube channel. I also put up various videos from my farm on that channel. And we also do, various interviews and farm visits and that sort of stuff. So that's an option as well. And our whole thing, like kind of our business model, is to try and find ways to make money giving stuff away. So we don't really hide anything behind a paywall. I mean, the book is about as close as we get. But we try and make sure that all of our information is freely available and, to the absolute best ability that we have. And so that's why the various podcasts, that's why the YouTube channel. And we have, so you can, supporting that at patreon.com/notillgrowers is also an option. But like I said, there's no paywall. That money goes towards just putting more information out there.
That's super cool. I like that a lot. And that sounds like a great podcast. We will include links to all of this information in the show notes. The other podcasts you mentioned earlier in the show, we'll be sure to link them up so people can find that information there. Next question. If people then want to take the next step to maybe start walking down that road of having a no-till farm themselves or getting involved in any other way, what can they do?
Yeah, I mean, that, the first step is, if you have a garden, then start reviewing the options for no-till in your climate. Not every method is going to make sense for you. Like, for instance, one of the methods that we use on our farm in central Kentucky, where we get on average 50 to 70 inches of rain a year, is we have been using living pathways. So this is very much like a strip tillage approach, but without the tillage part. We just, strip no tillage, if you were. So basically strips of living pathways with clover and grasses and all sorts of stuff. And then in between that is our garden beds, and then there's more pathways. And the idea there being to keep the soil in place. It's a nice soft landing for our feet and our knees when we're planting and harvesting. It's also very aesthetically pleasing, but it's not something that makes sense in every climate. It definitely does not make sense in a dry climate. There you'd want to use mulches like wood chips or, hay or straw or whatever you have access to. So, kind of figuring out, this is kind of why I designed the book like a choose your own adventure. You have to figure out what makes sense in your climate and what makes sense in your context. You may not have access to compost like we have here in Kentucky, where we're very rich in horse country. We have a lot of access to compost. So that's something that we're able to use on a larger scale than somebody who maybe doesn't have that option. So maybe has to look at different alternatives, such as, mulching with straw, or, there's using things like maybe you have wood chips that you can use in the pathways to preserve moisture and to kind of keep the pathways in place. So, part of it is just looking at your context and figuring out what you're working with, what your rainfall is, and what makes the most sense, what you have access to, what are your carbons, what are the wasted carbons in your area. Maybe it's leaves. Leaves are amazing. Maybe you have access to a lot of leaves, a lot of compost. Maybe you have access to a lot of wood chips. Those sorts of things, like evaluating what your carbon is. And then then it gets into market gardening. So you have to figure out like your crop plan and how you're going to move the produce. Starting a farm is like building a little city. It's like building an entire manufacturing industry. You have to do all the manufacturing, the distribution, the marketing, the sales, the customer service. All of it is, once you start a farm, it's a massive business. And that's why we kind of focused more on the collaborative farming element. But yeah, I think if anybody's, really interested, I think using those resources, the No-Till Market Garden podcast, there's also lots of really good podcasts out there. If you're really interested in getting into gardening, I think going back and listening to all of the, gardening for business, like doing a market garden, gardening is a lifestyle and a livelihood. Going back and listening to all the Farmer to Farmer podcasts from the late, great Chris Blanchard. I think those are really important. And I mentioned those two other podcasts, and then of course yours, Abby. And listening to the podcast that we've released too. Like I said, no-till flowers. Flowers are highly profitable. They're really important crop. Bringing in beneficials and butterflies and all those things. Jenny Love is the host of that one. And then Winter Growers podcast is great too. This is a time of year that people are not, that there's a lot of room for growth in the winter production area. And it's hosted by, some of the listeners will know, Elliot Coleman, his daughter, Clara Coleman, who's a wonderful grower. She's the host of that podcast. And so she does amazing work, and she brings out a lot of different techniques for winter growing in that podcast. So, I think, finding those resources and, deciding what your climate and your situation is. And there's a lot of great information on YouTube. It's not all perfect, and it's not all, there's no silver bullets in gardening, but there's a lot of great information, and it can give you, the more you study it, the more opportunity you have to succeed.
That's great advice. I like that a lot. Makes a lot of sense to me. And congratulations on having such a broad, successful network. That's really great.
Thank you.
Final question for you is, what is one fun fact that people would not know about you if all they had was your research, which I guess you could substitute book and our podcast for.
Right. I think that people may not. One thing that I was thinking about for this is I'm a diehard college basketball fan. And I think this is an important thing to mention because I had a mentor. I worked in wine for a long time, which is another, maybe fits this as well. But that's kind of what led me into agriculture to begin with, was working in wine and wine sales. And I studied wine constantly. It's all I did was read books on wine and talk about wine and think about wine. And I had a mentor who was a wine mentor, and my friend Alex Miranda. And he told me that one day he stopped me in the middle of a conversation. He said, you have to have passions other than wine, or you will never really appreciate wine. And I've thought about that for a really long time. And my current passion for the last couple, 12, 15 years has really been college basketball. That's for some reason, I find that I draw a lot of analogy from it. I get the break from just constantly thinking about farming. There's, just the excitement, the thrill of the game, but also just there's something about being able to turn a different side of my brain on and think about something totally different that somehow feels like it's beneficial to me in my research and my work. And so, yeah, I think that would be the one. Is I'm a diehard college basketball fan, and specifically growing up in Kentucky, I'm a University of Kentucky basketball fan. That's how it goes. It's a lifestyle here.
Sure. Wow. What sage advice, even from a fun fact. And I know a lot of people are who are really good at what they do. That is one of their secrets. Stephen King talks about that. And he's like, because I go for walks and I stayed married is why I'm a good writer, because I kept other parts of my life alive.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, thank you so much. This conversation has been obviously wide-ranging, but so rich, so dense, information-packed. I know your podcast is exactly the same way. I highly encourage people to check it out. Check out the book. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Abby, I've had so much fun. I love your show, and I'm just honored that you had me on.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.